So for those online who I may not have met previously, my name is Jackie Brady and I'm the Executive Director with Family and Relationship Services Australia, and very grateful to you for registering and joining us for this FRSA member webinar. Before we begin, and importantly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of this land. And from where I sit, that is the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I acknowledge the waterways, the land, the sky, and all who inhabit this place, this country. I acknowledge their ancestors and elders, and I recognise those who continue to protect and promote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. I acknowledge the past and stand together with First Nations people in a true expression of reconciliation with hopes and aspirations for the future. And I also acknowledge the importance of this year that we will have not too far away, and that is a referendum on the voice to Parliament. I pay my respects to any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people joining us online today. Sometimes I find it's a bit of a nice way to engage with one another. If you wanted to pop in the chat which part of this beautiful country you're coming from, but that's entirely up to you. So importantly though, today we are here to run a webinar on the National Centre for Action on Child Sexual Abuse, who they are and how they're responding to professional development needs. So we thought that this was a really good and important webinar to run on the back of the last one that we had run, which was around the Australian Child Maltreatment Study. And of course, we had Professor Ben Matthews presenting on that, which did find that across Australia, 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys have experienced some form of child sexual abuse before the age of 15. Now, I know that I don't need to repeat that for those on the line, but that's astounding. 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys have experienced some form of child sexual abuse before the age of 15. So we have today, thankfully, Dr. Leanne Beagley, who's the CEO of the National Centre for Action on Child Sexual Abuse, and Dr. Rosa Flaherty, who's the Manager of Practice Development at the Centre, joining us for the webinar. Leanne has extensive clinical leadership, business and legal qualifications and experience, holding executive roles within the Department of Health Victoria, the West Victoria Primary Health Network, and most recently, some of you may know her as the former CEO of Mental Health Australia. Rosa is the Practice Development Manager at the Centre and has extensive experience working clinically with victims and survivors of child sexual abuse, and other crimes, as well as managing training and building capability in staff. The webinar today will tell us about the centre, but the other thing that we have asked them to talk to us about is a recent survey that they conducted about the practice needs of people working with those people who have experienced sexual abuse in their life. And really, you are here to hear from Leanne and Rosa, not from me. So I have the pleasure now of handing over to the both of them. I'm going to jump offline now for about 40 minutes whilst they do their presentation, and we'll come back to you at about quarter past to join again. If you do have any questions that come up for you whilst Leanne and Rosa are talking, don't hesitate to pop them in the chat or the Q&A. We can pick up on them there or towards the end of the presentation. So thank you. Welcome, Leanne and Rosa. Really looking forward to hearing from you, and I'll see you in about 40 minutes.
Thanks, Jackie. Thanks very much. And hello, everyone. It's great to be here. And hello to those that I do know from a past life, and new friends here as part of this work. So, on behalf of Rosa and I, I'm coming from Wurundjeri land in Melbourne, and pay respects to elders past and present. And we also take the time to, if you can move to the next slide, Vanessa, we always take the time to recognise those and honour those who live with the impact of child sexual abuse through their lives. And we just like to share that we recommit each time to making things better for them and for those who live with the impact, as well as working to prevent child abuse. So we are delighted to be here, and I will speak for about 10-15 minutes to give you a bit of context on the National Centre, but the real information will come from Rosa. She'll tell you about our survey, and so I talked a little bit about the organisation, and then Rosa will talk about capability building. So who is the National Centre? If you haven't heard of us, today is your day. We were a recommendation from the Royal Commission, recommendation 9D, I think, which was that the Commonwealth and States and Territories together fund a national centre that essentially would continue to hold the space for victims and survivors and their stories, take leadership across the country around the development both of research and workforce capability, working to raise community awareness and lead the discourse around child sexual abuse. The partnership between Australian Childhood Foundation, Blue Knot Foundation and Healing Foundation is how we came together. So we're not part of them, they're part of us more. They're our board. The National Centre is an independent company, which was established late in 2021. And the vision is a community where children are safe and victims and survivors are supported to heal and recover as they deserve, which is a future without child sexual abuse. We'd like to announce that we've moved from establishment into consolidation as an organisation. When you start something from scratch, there's a lot to do, as you would all know. So last year was the year, and the first half of this year was the year of getting the organisational systems and staffing in place, getting the governance structure. So you'll see there's a blue line of committees that support the board, and there's an orange line of committees external to the organisation that advise us. And that includes two colleges that are up and running. One is a First Nations College of Advisors and one is an adult survivor-led college. And they work with us in lockstep to advise us on where we're going, what we're up to. We are developing the voices of children and young people in that process. We have just announced a competitive research grant set of outcomes, which I'll talk about in a minute. Have a new name, new brand, new logo, new website, and are increasing our social media presence. We're starting studies in harmful sexual behaviours and community attitudes, and we're planning our training program for 2023-24, which Rosa will talk to you more about. We have recently launched our Here for Change 5-year strategy. That's a strategy for the National Centre. That's an organisational strategy. And it's had 2 phases of consultation, and I hope that you got a chance yourselves to have some input into it. But essentially, Here for Change is, our commitment and our journey to transform the way child sexual abuse is understood and responded to. This is what we heard from the community when we went out with our draft 5-year strategy for consultation. That 90%, more than 90% of people felt like the way we'd approached it, in terms of thinking about 7 challenges that face us in our community, was the right way to approach it, and that each of the challenges were very or extremely important. That people really supported the direction set in the draft strategy, and that actually lots of people thought it would have some outcomes, which shows some real hope, given that lots of people are working in this space. And there does sometimes feel like there's so much going on, and yet the dial isn't moving. So the thing that I just want to touch on around the feedback was that people did feedback to us talking about a number of issues that they thought needed a little bit more work. One was around priority cohorts, which is and how we might partner with key areas, key organisations to advocate for greater prioritisation, and particularly children with disabilities and First Nations communities and culturally and linguistically diverse communities that came up in the conversation. There was a sense of, there's a lot going on. What's your particular role as the National Centre? What are you actually going to do? Lots of feedback about wanting to partner and talk with us about working together across different areas, and some ideas around prevention and a perpetrator focus. So people were wondering how the strategy could better address those two things, assuming they were the same thing. And I'd say to you that I don't think they are. There's plenty of overlaps, but prevention and primary prevention in child sexual abuse is a thorny issue that we need to grapple with together. And managing perpetrators and responding in that sense is an important issue as part of that. The other one is the gendered lens, both the gendered lens of perpetrators and the gendered lens that you take when you look at victims. And so there was a real sense that we needed to look at the interface more collaboratively with the domestic and family violence networks. Of course, there were lots of other insights on, where we should dot our I's and cross our T's. But this last slide on the strategy is really just that we then decided to focus on being really clear about the National Centre's place in the landscape. We're new and we want to partner. Sharpening up our roles and responsibilities vis-a-vis the work that all of you and others are doing, and integrating stakeholder voices more reliably in what we were doing. So there's an implementation plan, an elaborate, operational business plan to get things going. But essentially, these are the challenges, and you can see these on our website, the challenges that we're seeking to address and the changes we want to see. And we hope that that you'll join us in taking this forward. Thanks. We're a very little tiny team. It's always worth, there's a lot of quality here, not a lot of quantity. It's always worth letting you know how we're divided. So we've got three streams really, which is the keeping the boat afloat stream, the finance and corporate services area, the research, evidence, knowledge generation area, and the translation of that out into the world, practice and engagement and communications. So that's how the structure looks at the moment, but it's growing and changing as we go along. So very briefly, one of the requirements under our contract with the Commonwealth Government was to disseminate, or was to commission research. And there was $3.5 or $3.4 million in the contract for research. So late last year, we went out into the community and invited research applications. We have funded $2.99 million worth of research grants. That's 18 projects. Some are formal research and some are quality improvement projects to support inside organisations. You can find out more about them on our website. We're really excited about this. We got a great range of applications across the 7 challenge areas of our strategy, and we're delighted with the partnerships that we're able to see through this commission grants. We're also doing some in-house research. So one is about harmful sexual behaviours in children, and that's a formal study that's also funded by government. And we're also developing a community attitude survey. The survey is about to go out into the field. This is about talking directly to, this is about the pub test. Knowledge of, capacity to respond to child sexual abuse, harmful sexual behaviours in children, and the needs of adult survivors. So this is quite a comprehensive survey that's going out into the Australian community to help us get a sense of what people know and think. So there's all of the research grants, and I'll jump over those, but you'll get these slides as we go after the session, and you can certainly read more detail about them on our website. So the key issue for us will be, what we learn through the research, both in and outside, plus the knowledges that we gain from the lived experience voices, the practice voices, and the organisational voices and policy people to feed into our learning and development. So Rosa is going to talk to you about this, and so I'll jump over this now. But we essentially thought, well, we need to start with asking people what they want and need. What are the knowledge gaps? What are the learning needs? And how might we best approach skilling up professionals? this is my last slide before I throw to Rosa, and I just want to recap. So the unique offering of the National Centre and our strategy here for change is a razor-sharp focus on child sexual abuse, but not just on children. I just need to make that really clear, because when we talk about child sexual abuse, but in the adult and older persons areas, we're not really talking about child protection, right? We're not talking about children's support structures and support systems. We might not even be talking about family support systems. We are talking about health, mental health, and drug and alcohol services in the adult populations, and again with policing, justice, etc. So we are talking about a range of service providers when we think about practice and professionals that we're going to want to work with. Is not just those that are working with children and families, not to underestimate the need in that area, which you'll hear from Rosa about. We have victims and survivors and their experiences in the DNA of this National Centre, and it's guiding all of the work. We have an elaborate advisory structure, and it's not just it's not just in kind of in the pictures, it's in the DNA and in the strategic prioritising that we are doing as we go forward. We are completely independent of government, but we're in lockstep with government. We're fully funded by government. And so we're looking to expand our income, of course, and get some diversity, as we all are, but we are in lockstep with the agenda that they have in terms of the National Action Plan to reduce child sexual abuse. We want to be highly collaborative. We want to work together. The only way we can do this is doing it together. We want to build together, not duplicate. And we just want to go back to this bottom line, which is that research and theory and practice and service wisdom and procedural and organisational knowledge, cultural knowledge and lived and living expertise are all valued knowledge areas, and bringing them together is what's going to give us a way forward in our view. That's our vision. So I will now hand over to Rosa. Thanks, Rosa, to let you know more about learning and how we're going to approach that.
Thank you, Leanne, and I acknowledge I'm on Aboriginal land today, the land of the Gumbaynggirr peoples, and pay my deep respects also to Elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues on the webinar. I'm really delighted also to share some important insights from the National Centre's Learning and Development Survey with you today. Thank you for attending. I appreciate you've juggled your commitments in order to attend, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from you about what your learning needs are in relation to child sexual abuse. And I encourage you to take up the opportunity to ask questions at the end of the presentation and tell us how the National Centre can support you in this important area of work you do in the context of family relationships. The information I'm presenting today is contained within the just published Learning and Development Survey Report, which is available as shown on the screen here. On the National Centre website, you click on the Resources tab, then navigate to the report, and I understand the report's also going to be circulated after the webinar. So the National Centre conducted a survey throughout Australia in 2022 to the vast network of workers working in the area of child sexual abuse. And if you were one of those people who completed the survey, thank you for your contribution to the findings. We wanted to understand what topics people needed learning activities on, how they wanted to learn that learning, and such as if they preferred online training or face-to-face or one-off or self-paced courses, as well as other key challenges and practice issues related to child sexual abuse. The survey consisted of 14 questions and covered the 3 broad areas on the screen. You can see those were characteristics and demographics, skill and learning needs, and the organisational supports required to support people working in the area of child sexual abuse. So in terms of our response rate, that was really fantastic. We received 1,398 responses, and every state and territory was represented. The workforce demographics were not diverse in terms of gender, as 83% you can see there of participants were women. The largest proportion of participants worked in metropolitan services, and over half provided universal services. So universal services in this context are characterised as services that engage with victims and survivors of child sexual abuse as part of their work, but not as the primary target or focus of their work. 5% of participants were Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples, and almost 9% identified as from culturally or linguistically diverse backgrounds. And participants mostly worked with children and young people, but also almost half, 44%, said they mainly worked with First Nations communities. And you can see from the bar graph on the right-hand side that some of the higher proportion of sector representation were in the areas of community services, community and mental health, child protection and child and family welfare sectors. And insights here for us at the National Centre from the free text responses included that categories of workforces in future surveys we could include participants who work in out-of-home care or with institutional care leavers, in domestic and family violence fields, in sports and church groups, the arts sector, and community organisations like Rotary and Men's Shed and Lions Club and country shows, as well as aged care and volunteering. 31% of participants had a lived experience of child sexual abuse. And this is an important finding. That is that almost 1/3 of the workforce working with child sexual abuse had their own experience of child sexual abuse. And this statistic, as you might know, aligns with recent data from the Australian Child Maltreatment Study that found 28.5% of people living in Australia had been sexually abused as a child. And there've been several other reports and studies published on proportions of mental health and alcohol and other drug workforces who have a lived experience of those issues. But I just ask you to ponder, when was the last time you've seen Australian data on the proportion of workers with a lived and living experience of child sexual abuse? Knowing this information has implications for how people with lived experience are supported in the workforce to do this work. And noting here that 11% chose prefer not to say in answering that question, and due to that, this figure of 1/3 of the workforce having lived experience may in fact be much higher. Moving on to the second category of skill and learning needs, this included questions about workers' highest learning priorities in terms of topics they wanted training in, their levels of confidence in various areas of child sexual abuse work, as well as how well their formal study had equipped them to work in the area of child sexual abuse. Over 2/3 of participants rated their top learning priority as understanding the unique needs of First Nations and culturally and linguistically diverse families and communities to respond in a culturally safe way. And a further 26% said that this need was a somewhat need. So together, 94% of participants responded that how to provide culturally appropriate responses was a high learning priority. Participants were also asked to indicate their level of interest and need on 13 learning topic areas specifically, ranging from critical for my role to minimal need for that topic to be trained in. So 2/3 of workers wanted to know more about how to prevent child sexual abuse, and Leanne touched on that in her opening as well. Providing trauma-informed care, knowledge on both the Western and evidence-based clinical and non-clinical, such as peer support interventions, responding to harmful sexual behaviours, and knowing more about child sexual abuse in terms of the scale and nature of abuse were also key areas participants want learning offerings to focus on. And for those present today who have read the National Centre's 5-year strategy Here for Change, you can see how these learning priorities map very closely to challenges in the strategy, such as understanding child sexual abuse and its effects over the life course, and meeting the needs of children, young people who are at risk of or who've engaged in harmful sexual behaviour, knowledge about complex trauma and approaches for responding to complex trauma, and prevention. So when we asked to answer how confident participants felt across 3 areas, I guess they were key areas of identifying, responding to, and working ongoing with people who have experienced child sexual abuse, you can see that participants were most confident in the green to work in a child-safe manner and respond to disclosures of current child sexual abuse, and least confident in supporting families around the traumatic impacts of child sexual abuse. And I'm wondering how you rate your confidence in these 8 areas on the screen on things like working with children, young people experiencing traumatic impacts of child sexual abuse, or responding to a disclosure of historical child sexual abuse. If you're working a lot with adults, what's your confidence like with working with adults experiencing the traumatic impacts of child sexual abuse? In relation to learning needs, this finding on the extent to which formal study equipped workers was truly illuminating. So participants who undertook formal studies, example, undergraduate, postgraduate, or other formal study, were asked to indicate if they felt that study adequately equipped them to do child sexual abuse work and manage the trauma-related impacts of child sexual abuse. Only 9% in the light green there said that it did. So it's only 9% of over 1,000 people who answered this question. And in the qualitative responses, 21% of people said there were no child sexual abuse content in their study, their formal study. And a small percentage, so 10%, completed their training up to 40 years ago where child sexual abuse was, quote, not spoken of then. And a clear imperative here for the National Centre, identified in the comments of the survey, is to influence curricula at the tertiary education level so that child sexual abuse content is covered in the future. So to summarise the findings on skill and learning need, I'll just draw your attention to the right-hand side of the slide where workers want low-cost, free and flexible training, particularly for those in rural areas, learning activities that can be applied in everyday practice with realistic case studies. And participants also preferred short courses that are industry specific. For example, accessible short duration training tailored for professional groupings such as family support, legal practitioners, early childhood workers, and general practitioners. They were some of the main industry specific examples. The survey then asked what organisational support, that is, what was being provided or needed to be provided for worker wellbeing and professional development support to do this important work in child sexual abuse. There were 7 themes, and I'll take you through each of those now with some examples. So people value the opportunity to talk in clinical one-on-one supervision, group supervision and cultural supervision. Debriefing and informal check-ins with managers are appreciated, as is peer support. Employee assistance programs, in-house counselling and mental health first aid are helpful. However, 2% of participants also said that they had to pay for either their own mental health support via counselling or supervision to support themselves in their work. And access to professional development on topics such as self-care, trauma-informed care, vicarious trauma, cultural competency, and things like child safe standards is seen as an organisational support. In terms of self-care allowances, wellness payments, access to self-care smartphone apps, and formal wellbeing checks are also examples of valued organisational supports. Practice frameworks, caseload management, staff meetings, reflective practice and clinical reviews are also seen as supportive work practices. And flexible work settings, so that's theme 6, flexible work settings, hours and leave options, flexible work conditions, additional mental health days per year were example of supportive industrial provisions identified by survey participants. And theme 7 was a really important theme around culturally specific supports. So cultural care, training and mentoring, access to traditional healing approaches, and the importance of cultural induction prior to commencing work in a remote community are important cultural specific organisational supports. And before we move on, an interesting finding here was that of the people who said that wellbeing supports at their workplace were poor, okay, so they felt that the wellbeing supports were poor at their workplace, over 1/3 of those people indicated that their organisation does in fact currently provide EAP and or supervision, so employee assistance programs or supervision. So if your workplace does provide EAP and or supervision, but you still consider your work wellbeing supports are poor within the workplace, then this might indicate that supervision and or EAP may be necessary organisational supports for you to do this work, but not sufficient supports. And so those other wraparound supports in identified as positive organisational supports in these themes could be considered. So the question becomes, how can workplaces become more supportive and trauma focused? And again, these suggestions provided by participants map back very closely to the challenges identified in the National Centre's 5-year strategy, increased understanding of impacts on child sexual abuse, increased flexibility for staff, embedding a trauma-informed approach in the organisation, and confronting stigmatising attitudes and language in the workplace. These are examples of how workplaces can become more supportive and trauma-focused. Survey participants also saw the National Centre as having a leadership and influence role across areas such as workforce shortages, and I'm sure you can relate to that, development of national practice, best practice guidelines, advocating for policies at the national and state levels that support effective response to and prevention of child sexual abuse, and also things like providing information on children's sexuality and the continuum of sexual development, including providing that information to families and caregivers. So far at the National Centre, we've published a number of knowledge resources available on the website to support your practice. We've hosted a number of highly successful in-conversation webinars on topics such as prevalence of child sexual abuse, online technology facilitated abuse, complex trauma, and impacts that, as Leanne was saying, can follow people over their lives. Well, we also highlighted hope, healing and recovery within that too. And compassion, the importance of compassion when responding to people who've experienced child sexual abuse. And all of those resources are on our National Centre web page for you to explore when you can. We have a number of further learning and knowledge exchange activities planned, so please, keep an eye on the website for those. And those things are in relation to a number of these topics that that I've just talked through as a result of this learning and development survey findings. But we're really curious today, though, as to what parts of the information we've provided resonate with you. We want to know how the National Centre can support you in this important area of work. And you can contact my team at practice@nationalcentre.org.au with suggestions if you want to. That concludes my presentation. So I'll hand back to Jackie to facilitate the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosa. Thanks, Leanne. I do encourage people on the line to pop any thoughts in the chat or Q&A function. It certainly helps the conversation. The fact that you've signed up certainly means that this is an issue that you're wanting more information on, or that you're exploring, or you're seeking to refine. I think it was quite interesting, even from one of the things that resonated, I think a lot, Rosa, was the reflection. I think it was 31% of respondents to the surveys indicated that they themselves had lived experience of sexual abuse, or that they had family members with that. So I'm often reminded of that too when we run events, that when you have topics such as family violence and sexual abuse, that there are people that are listening to that who are themselves have been victims, or have family members who have been. So it's important as organisations to ensure that we have strong cultural safeguards, that we are strongly supporting those matters around vicarious trauma that will be happening there. So in terms of those findings in your survey, I know that it's relatively early days, but you also mentioned things around communities of practice, and we have been running ourselves, FRSA, some communities of practice. So do you envisage that somewhere down the line that might be something that the centre might be looking to deliver?
Can I just pick up on your first point first, Jackie, and thanks for the question. Yes, with the 31%, one of the take-home points specifically for that one is that organisations need to implement a range of supports, because no person's experience of child sexual abuse will be the same. Therefore, the impacts across their life course, and by the time they get into the workforce, may have had a range of different life experiences. So it's important that organisations and workplaces and people on this call as team members and colleagues, and perhaps managers or supervisors of people with and without lived experience of child sexual abuse in the workplace, that they really do try to have a number of strategies as organisational support. So thanks for honing in on that 31%. In terms of communities of practice, and Leanne might have something to say about this too, but I think at the moment we're really trying to engage very widely with multiple stakeholders across all of those workforce sectors, because as you understand, and in this group of people who are here today too, as part of Family Relationships Australia, is this is cradle to grave, covering the range of age groups that can be affected by child sexual abuse. And so you've got health, child protection, family support, police, legal services, teachers, all of those volunteer organisations and the arts sector, sporting groups. There's so many people that can be affected by child sexual abuse coming up in these contexts. So with communities of practice, I think we're at the stage of engaging with and consulting with those various workforces and sectors that respond to people and support people with child sexual abuse to see where that takes us. I don't know if you've got anything else, Leanne, to say there.
Yeah, I'll just add, but you should look in the chat. There's a couple of good questions for you, Rosa.
Okay.
So I guess what we don't want to do is add more burden to everybody, more things than on top of what everyone is already doing, the connections you already have, the support relationships, for example, you might get from Jackie and her team. So at the moment, we are looking at building into different workforces collaboratively in a co-design way into their spaces rather than setting up something ourselves. But if after our conversations and after we proceed down, testing some of these ideas, it looks like it's important that we set something up, we absolutely will. It's about it's about approaching with a question rather than with an answer. So, if there's a way of supporting, I'm very taken by the results you might, and you might be thinking through them yourself now, very alarmed by the lack of engagement in formal training about child sexual abuse, especially given the fact that everyone will know someone. Like the prevalence is high. So, you'll know people who may or may not have shared a history themselves. And we need to make it much more part of our everyday capability work and not feel like, oh, that's something special that someone special needs to do. We need to get better at relationships with children, conversations with children and families, with equipping families. Children don't, they are most likely to approach their mothers. So, what do we need to do around working with families that equip mothers to respond? Rosa, do you want to answer that one about?
Oh, actually, I was just going to jump in, Leanne, just to follow on from that, in terms of, some thinking from a practice perspective. So not with, noting, of course, that, as you say, that mums are the first ones that children might disclose to. But as practitioners, whether either yourself or Rosa could reflect on, can sometimes be seen as a challenge or tension between mandatory reporting and then providing support to a child who discloses child sexual abuse from their perspective that's provided to you in confidence. So that question about mandatory reporting and putting children at the centre of the work that you do, or that people do as practitioners.
Rosa, do you want to answer first?
Yeah, thank you. It's been a long-standing issue, hasn't it, Jackie? And for everyone here who practices in this area and has grappled with that issue or is concerned about grappling with it in the future, certainly in my experience, which has been long experience in service delivery, as well as managing services who do that type of work and deal with that issue of the tension between not wanting to get in the way and in some organisational policies for good reason are advised and not to become involved and interrupt, police or other, law enforcement processes that might be happening around the disclosure of child sexual abuse, because it is a crime. It is considered a crime and needs to be prosecuted as such. And so really my suggestions in relation to that is these are excellent conversations for supervisors. They're also really good conversations, and I've seen this happen time and time again over the years, to push for a organisational response and policy response to that within your own organisation if there's not enough clarity. But in terms of practice, I think it's very important to be ensuring that you've got all those good fundamental things in place when clients come into your service, that at the very outset you're explaining to them the bounds of your confidentiality, your responsibilities about mandatory reporting, so that they're consenting to your service and so that they know what types of things that they're happy to talk with you about and what types of things that they would talk to someone else about. But also acknowledging that if a disclosure is made and you're in that sticky situation of having to balance a mandatory report being made plus following up with the child and providing that support, it may be that your best focus is supporting the family and other significant others who are supporting the child or young person is the best way that you could approach that for that particular time.
Can I also jump in and say, you know, on the back of that really, I think, really skilled and practice-based response, which I completely endorse and support, we are also wanting to think about understanding more about disclosures, understanding how children disclose and how adults disclose. Picking up the point that someone raised about aged care, you know, what if someone goes into residential aged care, their body's being touched in ways that they don't consent to, and they are re-triggered by things that have happened in the past, or they're carrying a dark secret that they've had their whole life. As they're getting to the end of their life, they want to share it, etc. You know, we have to think about disclosures in a different way as well. So, you know, notwithstanding that it's a crime, and we do absolutely need to respond to that, and I'm with Rosa on that 100%. We also need to recognise that kids might tell you a little bit, and it's over time that you actually hear the full amount, or adults might wait for a trusting relationship before they can do that. And it is about how we respond wherever it is, whenever it is. It is about saying, you know, people who know me know I've been in the mental health sector for 35 years. The mental health sector is good at saying they're trauma informed, but it's not always reliable that mental health practitioners will ask what happened to you. There is a focus on what's wrong with you, right? And we have to move away from that. We have to change that. We need to be asking what's happened and understand what it might mean over someone's whole life. So we do want to change the discourse, you know, and think about disclosures and about responding to people better, way better than we do now.
Sue Winter-Page was asking, what are your thoughts around the lack of academic training in this area? You did reflect on the formalised training in absence of training in child sexual abuse. So it seems it is an area that degree level education struggle with in addressing. So yeah, what are your thoughts, or I suppose aspirations, in terms of how you want to see that change?
Well, we would like to see a change, and we'd like to certainly so it's part of our longer term thinking about how we can influence that. There are some issues, aren't there, around, you know, and coming from the health sphere, there's often this kind of accreditation idea, or, you know, credentialing and etc. Through the APRA sort of process within health professionals, which creates, you know, training, particular prescribed training, and then an obstacle that you need to jump over, and then an accreditation. And that is tempting. That's tempting. But and we do need to talk with the different craft groups about what they need and what they think will help. And lots of people have lots of ideas, and they, you know, it's quite a complicated competitive space. But I don't think that we cannot, given the prevalence and incidence of child sexual abuse, or you know, in the adult population as well, that we can avoid or continue to allow, you know, basic training to not have this in it. At least at the very least, how you respond. Rosa, I hope you're on the same page with me.
Of course, Leanne.
Oh, good.
And I just add to Sue Winterpage's question there. Thank you, Sue. It's a really important issue to focus on, is that because of the complex kind of matrix of legislation around child sexual abuse in Australia as well, that's one of the challenges with getting kind of standardised foundational training that can apply to anyone. But what we found in the survey, so across the board, what we found in the Learning Professional survey was that even people who've recently done master's level courses, and some of them did kind of name and shame who the university was and the name of the course they had done, that had no, and we're talking about Master of Social Work courses here, had no child sexual abuse content in them. So when you say, what are your thoughts around the lack of academic training? Absolutely what Leanne said. It's a dire need to include specific content, given the prevalence of people who have experienced and continue to experience today child sexual abuse. And in the number of strategies that Leanne spoke to as well about how we might influence that, we're trying to develop our partnerships with peak bodies, with the universities, and, you know, various institutions to make sure that we are at the ready to be able to provide them that content that they could then choose to put into these subject areas. So thank you, Sue.
Thank you. Craig Brereton's asked a question around the National Principles for Child Safe Organisations, acknowledging that that's a broader than your remit, but are there audits, accreditation expectations for organisations to apply the National Principles for Child Safe Organisations to embed a strong child safe culture and governance across all organisations?
Not from us. So we're not an accrediting body, and we won't be involved in that at the moment. And you know that, but there are obviously state-based arrangements. And I don't know, Jackie, do you do training on that yourselves?
No, we don't. And there is, I think there is an absence of a formal, like in terms of a formal accreditation process in that area. So at the moment, all funded providers under the Department of Social Services need to show evidence that they are fulfilling those principles under the national principles. And essentially they sign a statutory declaration saying that they are adhering to those principles. But in terms of some sort of auditing or accreditation mechanism, and I noticed that Craig did say that there's the work going on in the Catholic Church, so they have a specific body that has been set up that oversees that area of activity. I know that there are, I think the Australian Childhood Foundation does some work in that space, and a number of other bodies. But nothing that I suppose is at the level of some specific quality, like if I was to compare it to ISO or quality assurance type measures that exist out there in the marketplace. It's it's quite different.
Well, Craig, I think you've uncovered a gap there. That and look, the reality is that again, child safe organisations are not focusing on adults living with the experience of child sexual abuse as well. So if we were thinking about how people might have an audit of how well they're doing, and or a self-reflection or a self-review on how well they're doing in that space, I would want to see both. How we're responding to children safely, how are they included in our decision making, how do they have their own voice, and how do we respond to victims and survivors of child sexual abuse as well.
Yeah, thank you. Now I'm going to squeeze in one last question, because it was one I thought that was really important in what you had brought up in your survey response. So Rosa, you did note in the presentation you gave us that 68% of respondents reported understanding the unique needs of First Nations and culturally and linguistically diverse families and communities and responding in both a culturally safe and appropriate manner was their top learning priority. So a
Yes.
question is, are there many resources and training that you know of that's currently available in that space?
In terms of child sexual abuse specifically, not really. We are involved in a couple of partnerships at the moment in developing some resources around that, and due to our assistance with that not being the lead on some of that work, I'll leave it to other organisations to speak about that specifically. But given the findings of this survey, it is absolutely a priority for us to be working on that. But we obviously need to ensure that the lead on that is done in a culturally safe and appropriate way by people who have the cultural authority to actually do that work. And so we're absolutely supporting and partnering to get those resources together, but that work's led by the cultural experts essentially.
Can I also say that, because I noticed the time and I'm sure that the busy people in this space, they'll need to run off. Can I invite people to go to our website and join up in terms of getting our newsletter? Because as we start to grow and develop the resources that we've been talking about today, you'll be using our newsletter process to let people know when we're having webinars, when we're doing training, what new resources there are, etc. And just really encourage you to do that, and also to give us some feedback. If you think that we're hitting the mark, let us know. And if you think we really missed it, please especially let us know then. Thank you, and thanks for having us.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you both for being with us today. Thanks to everybody who's on the line, stayed on the line, been part of the conversation. I noticed that you're getting some thanks in the chat, that it's been thought-provoking and people have really valued the information that you've shared. So thanks again. It's good to make the connection, and we certainly look forward to working with you, Leanne, Rosa, and your team moving forward.
Thanks, Jackie.
Thanks so much,
everyone.
Jackie.
Have
Bye,
a good day.
everyone.
Bye.